Hi, our guest today is State Senator Ryan Fattman, who's running for a third term in the November 6th state election. Senator, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me on, Kevin. Nice to see you
again.
Al.
So the first question we usually ask people is,
why are you running?
Oh, yeah, you know the question.
why are you running, and basically, what do you want to tell the people about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm Ryan Fattman. I'm the state senator for the Worcester, Norfolk district, which has 14 towns. And I've had the privilege of serving as the state senator for the last 2 terms, and now running, as you alluded to, for my 3rd term. And for me, this is about making Massachusetts an affordable, accountable, and responsible place for citizens to live. Making sure that we don't go back to the ways of Taxachusetts, that we keep our budget in order, just like a family does, and also making sure that there's accountability. I think I've stood for that, and I'm happy to talk to you about that this evening.
I was going to say that's pretty much been your campaign platform the last 2 terms.
Yes, yep.
So nothing changing.
No, not really. You know, it always manifests itself in different ways. I think
Right.
in a 3rd term, I'd like to take on more issues of mental health. I'd like to look more at opioids. You know, these are things that I've come across as issues that are really important to the people that I represent. I've been proud of the work that I've done on some of them already. For example, opioids. Brian Murray and I have worked with Amy Leone. And before that, it was John Fernandez and I. And we got money to help fund the program that she runs that addresses intervention when it comes to people who get addicted. You know, for me, I think of names like Patrick Kearney from the town of Millville, 24 years old, passed away from a wonderful family. Evan Rodriguez, another kid from Hopedale. These are young men who had their whole lives ahead of them, and they lost their lives because of an addiction.
It's the average family now. It's not the old image Al and I grew up with of the guy in the back alley. It's people's sons and daughters.
Absolutely.
Or even 40 or 50-year-olds who you know, go upstairs and come down.
And that's part of my record, trying to work to bring things home for the district. But
you
also
brought some money for the downtown Milford improvement.
Yeah, we got $150,000.
Wow, that's a lot.
I got asked to come to a downtown redevelopment committee meeting. They shared their vision with me. Josh Leosh was the one that invited me. And you know, downtown Milford is, I think, what can be a really wonderful destination. And so I was able to put $150,000 in the Senate budget. We successfully got that through.
I think you ought to take that committee and bring them out to Webster, out at where you live, because they seem to have a thriving downtown.
Yeah, and actually we modeled what we did in Milford after Webster. I actually got $125,000 to the town of Webster for a very similar type initiative. Downtown Redevelopment Authority, facade improvement, building improvement. And so we were able to get that money, and I used the same language, just changed the town of Milford in the state budget, and we were able to get a little extra money because the budgetary issues are going in the right direction. Things are doing pretty well in Massachusetts.
$1 billion surplus.
Yeah.
Not
a
bad.
$1 billion surplus, yep.
Mental health. What kind of things are you doing in the mental health area?
So I worked very hard on a bill that passed through the criminal justice reform. I met a woman named Alice Seish from the town of Uxbridge, and at one point she lived in Millbury. And her son was stabbed 138 times and murdered. And what was sad about this was the person who committed the crime was mentally ill. It was his wife. And they were actually on the other side of the door listening to their son and brother die. Just absolutely tragic. She approached me after approaching many people about wanting to do something about it, because she was fearful that the killer was going to get out and not have a criminal record, because when they went through the trial, they were deemed insane. And so people who commit heinous crimes that are deemed insane don't have criminal records. I helped change that law. So now somebody who does commit a heinous crime will have a background check. And the reason why this is important is because when I was doing the research, we found a mother who had drowned 4 of her children,
Right.
that 8 years later was working at Boston Children's Hospital. And while that's anecdotal, there are 63 people who are
Wow.
individuals who within 10 years who had killed people, were out walking amongst us on the streets, chaperoning, volunteering, and no one knew that they had actually committed an act of murder. What I think we need to do to improve this bill is create a probationary period. So if you commit a crime and you are found competent, you get out and you have a probationary period where you have to check in with a PO, probation officer. If you're mentally ill and you're deemed insane when you commit a crime and you get out after rehabilitation, you do not need to check in with the probation officer. I think that's a serious flaw in our legal system and our criminal justice system. And so that's one of the things that I'd like to institute, making sure that people who are deemed insane, who then go through the rehabilitation process, still have to check back in and are made sure that they're doing well and that they're not a threat to society.
Interesting. Wow. Very interesting. Now, what are you doing about mental health treatment for people that have mental health?
Well, I think for this area, one of the things that's really important development is what's going to be happening in Hopedale. Riverside is putting together beds and building a new facility, and they've approached me about trying to help them with that. I think that Frank Saba was actually the one who asked me to sit down, because Frank is now working over at Riverside.
Right.
And
former head of Milford Hospital.
Former head of Milford Hospital. And he said, hey, this is something that we would like your help with. And I said, I'm on board. Any way I can help, whether it be state funding or taping a video, just like this, to help raise awareness and also funds privately. One of the things that's amazing to me is how generous the people are of this area. People give their own money, reach into their own pocket, and are more than willing to help out. You see that with Milford Hospital, with the emergency room that was built. I get to go to the Melange every year in support of that initiative, and just see the amount of money that privately people are willing to donate. So I think these are really good things, and some things that will help the district.
Yeah.
Is there one overriding issue across? I know the district's large, but is there one or two overriding issues throughout the district that you find?
I think for me, I was a selectman in my hometown of Sutton. I served 2 terms on the Board of Selectmen, and I ran because I got so frustrated with A, unfunded mandates, B, local aid, and C, education. And I think that that's something that universally affects all the towns in our district, some more than others. I represent sort of 2 paradigms. One paradigm is more of a suburban urban area like Milford and Southbridge, Webster, even Bellingham to an extent. And then you got more of a rural type background of these communities like Mendon, Hopedale, Sutton, Dudley. Those towns are more former agrarian towns that are sort of changing with the times. They've become bedroom communities. So I think that universally those issues are important, but what I'm proud of is my record. I have voted to change the Chapter 70 funding formula to help benefit the communities in my district. But before I ever did that, I helped kick that process off in 2011 as a state representative. When I got into the legislature in 2010, that was my first election, in 2011, they were talking about the funding formula that hadn't been changed in nearly 2 decades
That's
for
the school
education.
formula.
Right, school
Chapter
formula, which is 80
Chapter
pages.
70. Yep. And so, there was a whole bunch of us that said, hey, we need to do something about this. Let's form a commission. And I was one of the co-sponsors of the legislation that actually led to the commission, that led to the recommendations, that led to a vote this past July to actually change the funding formula, which passed 40-0 in the state Senate.
It has not gone through the House yet.
It got through the House as well, unfortunately, and I try to be as bipartisan as possible, but the Democratic leadership in the Senate and the House could not agree to the changes. Each one had different changes in their formulas, and it had to do with ratios, and it died. It died in committee. And
So is that
that
going
was
to be brought back in the next session?
Yes, that was the furthest this process has ever gotten with
Right, because
changing
the
the
session
chapter.
ends at the end of December, correct?
Yes, it will.
And then you start a new-
January 1st actually will be the last day of the session.
And then you start a new legislative year.
Yep, yeah,
is
it will
really
be
2
the
years.
191st.
It's really 2 years, isn't it?
It's every 2 years. Yes.
Okay, so that bill will be brought back.
It can be brought back yeah.
It will be.
Great.
And I believe that, unlike this past session, they're not going to wait till the very end. I think it should be one of the first priorities that's taken up. And I don't think just talking about Chapter 70 is really enough. Look at regional school transportation. I've got 3 regional schools in my district. We made a promise decades ago that we would fully fund that. Republicans have made an effort on Beacon Hill constantly to say, let's not make more promises that we can't keep. Let's fund the ones that we should be keeping or should have kept decades ago. I'm very proud of that effort that I've made, and I've lived it as a selectman, having to make these decisions in a community where we had tough financial times in 2006, 2007, 2008, and then the economy collapsed and things became a lot more difficult.
I think it's something like Douglas, which is in your district.
Douglas, yeah.
Douglas.
Really is.
Millville, Douglas.
Right.
Millville turned down an override and has really cut back.
Yeah.
Douglas barely passed an override to keep things open.
13 votes.
It's
So for those who don't think every vote counts, let that
Right.
be a lesson.
Right. Right.
But I think, just as important as what you bring back is the
Yeah.
ideas that you bring up. And one of the things that I've brought up constantly is just effort, right? I have never missed a vote. I have 100% voting attendance. And that's not just in the last 2 years, the last 4 years. I've never missed a vote in my time in the legislature, including the House of Representatives. I'm one of the few people who has that record.
amazing.
Second, when I think I have voted, it's been for common sense. We're living in a crazy world right now. And I think a lot of people kind of look to Washington, D.C. As a manifestation of that craziness. On Beacon Hill, we've had some craziness too, but I think for the most part, we work across party lines to try to get things done. I think the governor's a great example of that. But for me, I've passed laws that I think are commonsensical. I wrote a law that said you can't use welfare to buy marijuana after the marijuana initiative passed in 2016
Could
by
you
the
actually
voters.
use it before that?
It wasn't on the books, so therefore there was a
okay.
loophole and it had to be closed. And that's in addition to laws that I've co-sponsored for closing the loophole for EBT cards to be used for alcohol, tobacco products, lottery tickets. I voted no on a pay raise vote. That I think was inappropriate. I listened to the arguments back and forth, but what I know is this. I represent about 165,000 people in my district. There's only one who can vote to raise his own pay. That's me. That's not really representative democracy, is it? And most people, the average pay raise was about 40%. And of course, it wasn't your actual salary, it was stipends and reimbursements and this type of thing. But the reality is, most people don't see a 40% jump over the course of 1 year. God bless you if you do. But you know what?
Not over
Most
several.
people don't see it over 10 or 20 years.
Right.
And so that's where I think we're supposed to be government of the people, by the people, for the people. That's government above the people. So I voted no. I turned down the money when it was offered, wrote a letter to the clerk saying, I don't want to take this. It's not appropriate. I voted no. I don't think that should be the salary for this term. And I'd rather see the money spent here locally.
But you did take a leadership stipend.
Yep, I've always taken stipends. That's something that I've taken since I got into 2011. What I said I would not take was getting paid to drive to work.
Right.
And the per diems. I've always had a problem with them for several reasons. First, a lot of the people that I represent don't get paid to drive to work. They can maybe write off mileage on their taxes, which I'm fine with, but they don't get a stipend to drive to work. Second, there's no level of accountability in that system. You didn't check in and say, oh, I'm here, Mr. Clerk. They gave you a form and you wrote how many days that you had gone in, and you could submit it up to 2 years after you'd actually served the term.
Wow.
That's ridiculous. And part of the thing that made me sad about the pay raise vote is that's where they eliminated the per diems because they were called indefensible. I like to think of myself as one of the pioneers that helped get rid of it, mostly because I ran 2 campaigns where I criticized my opponents for taking it, in addition to raising the gas tax and being inoculated from that.
Wow.
That's a lot to chew on.
That is. It is. Are there any other things that you're focusing on
Yeah.
in your spare time?
Yep. One of the things that I promised in my 2014 campaign, I said no mandates, no unfunded mandates.
Yep.
That's something I think I've kept up. I also talked about Massachusetts becoming a sanctuary state, and that's something I don't support. And when that vote came before the Senate, I tried to rally the Milford community to oppose that. All 3 selectmen stood with me and talked about the detriments of some of the immigration problem here, illegal immigration. I think that's important to note. And we had a press conference talking about why this is such an important issue. And really, it doesn't have to do with immigration so much as it has to do with public safety. Back in July 2017, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts took up a case called the Lund decision. And the Lund decision decided that there was no law on the books in Massachusetts that allowed for a local police officer to honor an ICE detainer. And an ICE detainer is,
Right.
Something that gets sent out to a police department when someone gets pulled over or apprehended or arrested, and they look up, okay, who is this guy? They do it to everybody. They don't do it because you look a certain way,
Well,
or
they do it to everybody.
they do it to anyone who comes.
And ICE says, we need you to detain that person.
And usually it's because of a significant reason.
Right.
Drug trafficking, violent crimes, those types of things. It's not usually somebody jaywalked. And so in July 2017, essentially we created this problem for law enforcement that if they have somebody who is potentially dangerous, who also happens to be here illegally, that they cannot wait and hold that person for ICE to show up and deal with them through the judicial and
Right.
criminal justice process. And so that's another reason why I'm running for re-election. I want to solve that Lund decision. I want to put a law on the books that says you have the ability as a police officer to detain somebody who is not here legally, just like ICE has asked. I think more cooperation amongst law enforcement is a good thing. I think when you're cutting off communication between these individuals, you truly aren't learning the lessons of 9/11. There was a whole report written in the 9/11 Commission talking about how law enforcement must communicate with one another on all levels in order to avoid threats.
But to be clear, what you're saying is, if not to stop any illegal immigrant, but those that there's an ICE request to detain.
Yeah, you have to be in the act of doing something illegal to even be in question, right?
True.
So you're breaking and entering, or assaulting and battering an officer,
Or you're speeding.
Whatever, you're speeding or whatever.
speeding, and then you get pulled over, and then someone runs your record, and not only have you violated, speeding, but you are wanted for murder. There's real life examples. There was a woman in Chelsea who had her throat slashed by a guy who was wanted. What people don't realize about that guy who was wanted is the police in Chelsea had him in custody 2 weeks previous.
But had to let him go.
And they let him go because they couldn't detain him. And now a woman's dead because of it. Now, that's an extreme example, but that's one life.
But not
there's
to
no
her family.
Exactly. There's no one that's going to bring her back.
Well,
and that's unfortunate.
Well, the other piece of the puzzle is if they come into this country illegally the first time they're caught, it's a misdemeanor.
Right.
The second time, it's a felony.
It is. Yeah.
And so what happens is that if someone comes in the first time and it's a misdemeanor, okay, they for whatever reason they came in. But once they do it the second time, then it's a whole nother story. They're not coming in for the reasons that most people come in for.
Absolutely. And one other thing to note is, we don't live in Russia. We live in the United States of America. And there's this misnomer that individuals who are actually apprehended by ICE don't go through any due process. They do. They go through an immigration court, and that judge is the one that makes the ruling of whether or not they should leave the country or not. It's not just like you get the boot. And so that's not really well reported. And I think, unfortunately, it's probably for political reasons that that's not well reported.
That's exactly the case.
Well, what are your feelings on legal immigration? I know you and I were talking after the tornado touched down in Webster.
Yeah.
And you had several people, I remember, with green cards where their cards were lost.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
you and the U.S. senators were trying to get them back for them.
Yeah.
What are your feelings on people who come here following the right procedure? And
I think that's the greatness of our country. My family came from Ireland, my wife's family came from Greece, and they've made good lives for themselves here. And that example that you're talking about, a real life example. I was supposed to be going to an Eagle Scout ceremony, and I
you're
called you
supposed
up.
to be visiting me, maybe?
Yeah, right. And I called you up and said, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be there. I have to send somebody because 2 days before the tornado had come through.
Well, you lost 3 buildings downtown.
Lost
in
3
Webster.
buildings, and
Brick buildings,
one
too.
of the people that were displaced was a new immigrant family, and they were from Iran, and they had sought political asylum, and they received it, and all of their paperwork was in the building that got destroyed. And so, I worked with Senator Warren. Actually, it was a very impressive effort that they made. I called their office within 20 minutes. There was an aide from Springfield that was on the phone with me, went through the situation, and we worked with Warren's office and the State Department to get their green card back successfully. But I wouldn't want, just to be frank, I would not want to be an immigrant right now who loses their green card and can't document that they're here. I think that's incredibly important for that community and something that I'm very sensitive to.
Yeah, that stuff should be held electronically and easily accessed also.
Yeah.
You would think.
You would think.
You would think, but
Yep.
having tried to access other things, it's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, no, there's no question.
Bureaucratic process.
Yes.
Any other things that you're focusing on?
Infrastructure. That has been a big component to sort of my legislative agenda. There's been various bond bills that have come through, and I've tried to utilize those bond bills to get funding for district initiatives. One thing in Bellingham, there's an opportunity there for a $40 million investment by Campanella on South Maple Street. And the selectman approached me and said, hey, this is a really good opportunity potentially for Bellingham and for the general area. And so I listened, brought out Jay Ash, the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, did a walk around, continued to follow up. And we had put in about $2 million to an economic development bond bill. We got $1.7 million for this project released by the administration. Now, some people think that that's fake money, but that's not fake money. It's real money, and it makes a difference in communities.
Well, you have to first get it into the bond bill, and then it's a matter of what's released out of the bond bill.
Exactly.
But it's still the first step is to get it listed in there.
Yep, and this is something that, you have to give credit where credit is due. Dick Moore had put in Godfrey Brook to one of the environmental bond bills back in, I think, 2014. And it was up to me to get that money released, and we did. And that helped, the town of Milford. But if you look in general at the Massachusetts economy, over the last 4 years, things are going in a real right direction. 150,000 jobs have been created.
Right.
773 of those jobs have been created in 5 towns in my district: Milford, Southbridge, Sutton, Mendon, and Oxford. Oxford has 400 new jobs that are coming because of the IPG expansion, a photovoltaic laser company,
Right.
high-end manufacturing. One of the businesses that goes directly to Blackstone Valley Tech and looks for students as part of their employment pipeline.
Just curiously, what's Milford gotten for employment?
It was the construction company that's eluding me.
Oh, Consigli.
Consigli. Yeah,
Consigli.
they built the new facility. They added 50 new jobs, and it was a $5.5 million investment. And that's 50 jobs that
50
are
more than- right.
going to create economic growth.
Right.
And
which
those are
is
good paying jobs. That's not minimum wage.
Absolutely.
Well, one of the other things that's going on in Massachusetts, all over the country, is infrastructure, roads, bridges, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which is significant. We haven't invested in those things in a long time.
Yep.
And then we're now beginning to pay a price. in
Yeah,
bridges.
exactly.
I have to tell you, I drove into downtown Boston today for an appointment in one of the many fine hospitals we have. But it took me pretty close to about an hour and 40 minutes from Milford to Boston on the Pike
Yep.
in the morning. And for the first time I said, how can you sustain this in terms of the economy?
Mm-hmm.
People aren't going to want to wait an hour and 45 minutes just to get to their job.
Yeah.
We need some other way of fixing that, clearing it up, doing whatever.
I was with the lieutenant governor over the weekend. We were campaigning together in the town of Uxbridge, and we were talking a little bit about this door to door. And one of the guys pointed out to us, one of the detriments of a good economy is there's more people on the roads. More people are going to work. And for me, I look at just my involvement in trying to make sure that different initiatives get funded. There's a lot of issues that have been out there for many years that I think have been ignored. One of those issues is the Draper Mill. And finally, you have the town of Hopedale that's really putting together a pretty comprehensive plan. Tom Wesley had reached out to me in the very beginning and said, hey, I think I'm going to try to lead something on this. Do you think you can help? And I said, Tom, I'll be there right by your side every step of the way.
the owner of the property has been the stumbling block
I
for
understand.
Well, we got
That's-
40
that's
years.
squared away. That's beginning to move in a positive direction, I understand.
It is, and I was able to put $4 million into an environmental bond bill because, as we know, there's some cleanup that needs to happen there at the very basis
kidding.
of the foundation.
But they're
So-
talking possible rail connection, they're talking homes, they're talking shopping center.
Yep.
I mean, that's going to be, you know,
It's significant.
especially when nobody has worked in that building for just about 38 years.
And the most important part, in my opinion, about this initiative is that it's phased in. It's not all at once. It's talking about doing it over the course
And
of
it
time.
brings a lot of jobs to that area.
Absolutely.
A lot of jobs.
Yep.
Over the long haul, that'll be a significant, and it also may bring a connection to the rail system.
Yes.
For commuting, which will relieve a great deal of stuff in Mendon and Upton and places like that.
Yes.
So, I mean, the positive aspects of it are significant.
Yeah.
Significant.
And these are signs of our times, right? You know, we're living in a good economy. I mentioned 150,000 jobs, 773 just here locally. You know, but more people are working now than any other time in our history. Welfare rolls have dropped 75% over the last 4 years. That's stunning. 1,500 people who were living out of hotels and motels that were homeless is now down to 50. Because we've been able to place people in short-term and long-term housing. You know, these are tremendous steps in the right direction and something that I'm very proud of. But more than anything, you talked about budget, $1 billion surplus. We put $600 million away for a rainy day fund. One of the biggest concerns that I've had is in 2015, our bond rating dropped from a AAA to a AA. You know, still pretty good. We're not Chicago or, you know, Illinois, right?
Yep.
But the reality is, when we borrow money, we want to have the best bond
Best you
rating
can, right.
available.
And the more you have in savings, the better the bond rate.
Exactly. It's just like any individual and any household. If you have a credit card and you have a sizable bank account, you're able to get a bigger limit and a better rate. And so that's really important. And sometimes you'll get a zero rate if you're really good. And so these are things that we've improved upon. We've invested $500 million over the last 4 years in education. It's the highest funding that it's ever had. Of course, as I described, I think we need to do more with regards to making sure that the Chapter 70 funding formula for education is distributed and equitable across the
Yes.
board for middle-class suburban communities, because right now it is not. But the reality is we're making improvements and we're getting there in a concise fashion.
Ed reform was a significant event when it occurred, but there were some things that they overlooked.
Yes.
And I happened to be involved with the school system when ed reform passed.
Yep.
And it was some good things that occurred as a result of it. But
Some
bad
great things.
But some bad things happened also.
Absolutely, but one thing I'd like to point out is look at our schools. We have the best public school system in the entire nation. We rank number one for math and science. We rank number one for literacy and reading and English. I mean, these are huge improvements. When you look at STEM education,
Right.
we have the best scores in the nation. This is really good developments. But I also think we need to start talking more, and this is a generational thing, about tuition and education costs. And so I've been putting ideas on the table for that to make sure that we call it the right to know before you go. A student, before they're sold a bill of goods, which, you know, a lot of times I think, unfortunately, my generation with $1.3 trillion in debt and student loans, they have. And we need to make sure that there's transparency in all costs across for higher ed.
Well, the other piece of
Oh, I hate to stop you both there, but we're actually at a time.
oh,
Well, I've enjoyed this very much.
Last word to the potential voters.
Yes, thank you very much for taking the time to listen today. I asked if you could remember Fattman in November. I greatly appreciate that.
Thank you very much.